Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got a nice group here. Summer's here. I'm picking up today. We're going to finish this lesson on Yahweh abandons the temple. So if you've got that one, I'll probably read a little bit out of the biblical text. If you want a Bible handy, if you don't have one, you grab a few. And then you can have one. And anybody, you want a Bible, Becky? All right, you guys. Yeah, you guys need a Bible. So we're using the ESV. So I'll read out at that. If at any point I want to fuss with a particular word or phrase, it's in the lesson. I'll go from there. So I'll start off with something outside of Ezekiel. This is a very important section of the book. In Leviticus chapter 16, you got your first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Leviticus is the central book, one of my favorites. Some of you know that I'm a big Leviticus guy. But in the 16th chapter, we have the ritual for Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur means the Day of Atonement. And so in the book of Leviticus, every year, around the 7th month, that would be in the fall, the high priest goes on this ritual, and you've probably heard about it, if not read it, where he goes through all 3 parts of the tabernacle and then later the temple. And he's got the outer court where the bronze altar is, and then there's inside where the menorah and the gold altar is. That's the holy place. And then in the innermost part of the temple, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant is, that's the only day of the year he enters that room. And this ritual is unique to Israel in some ways, but it's known in other temples throughout the ancient Near East. Anytime you have a deity dwelling in a temple, you have to make sure that it is a fit dwelling place. Otherwise, the deity will leave, the community will be left just sitting ducks. So that ritual, they talk about it in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews. Jesus' work on the cross is compared to that of the high priest. Anyways, he takes the blood of various sacrifices and he puts it on the different parts of the temple. The bronze altar in the outer court, the gold altar in the holy place, and he'll sprinkle it on the cover, or they call it the mercy seat sometimes, of the Ark of the Covenant. And what that does is it absorbs, so to speak, all of the sin of the nation. And then there's that famous ritual where they take the goat, right? And the priest puts his hands on the head of the goat. And he confesses the sins of himself and the entire nation. And then they take that goat out into the wilderness. So all the way back in the days of Moses, the idea is there. You keep the temple pure. Otherwise, Yahweh will have to leave the temple, and then it's nothing but an empty building. And that actually does happen in the history of Israel. And this is the only real part of it's not the only part of the Old Testament where it's talked about, the only part where it's described of Yahweh getting up and leaving the temple. So this is his, I've had it, enough of this moment. And Ezekiel gets a vision of it. Now, let me stop and see if there's any questions or comments about that. That's just sort of a prelude to what we're going to look at today. Yeah?
It's interesting that there's a bit of tension between statements where God says he's going to come into the sanctuary, and he says, this is a place I will put my name forever, and then the fact that he in fact leaves. So even though he says he's going to put his name there forever, I would assume there is some kind of implied condition that that's forever, so long as everybody behaves themselves.
You do have that tension in other parts of the Old Testament too, where Yahweh speaks in unconditionals.
Right.
But the actual playing out of things, there are conditions for unconditionals. It reminded me of when I used to teach at this school. I've told this joke before. We worked for years to get the Association of Classical Christian Accreditation. We got our permanent accreditation. Permanent. And then they got together and they had a meeting and they said, we need to renew our permanent accreditation. I said, I thought this was a Calvinist school. I don't understand what's going on here. Renew your permanent? We're starting to sound like Arminians. They didn't think that was a funny joke. They were like, I thought it was funny. I thought it was funny. So, yeah, the Bible uses hyperbole. I'll say that at the very least, especially in the books of the prophets, because there's passion in the literature. So all, every, none, for generations to come. And then, so we do have to accept that there is hyperbole in the Bible. Jeremiah uses it quite a bit. One of my favorite passages, when I led you out of Egypt, did I ever ask you for sacrifice? And I feel like you did. Actually, you did ask for sacrifice. But Jeremiah's making a point. He's saying that wasn't really what it was all about. So here, the divine glory has now, last week, so we come to our second vision in Ezekiel chapter 8. This is the second vision in the book. And he has a vision of the figure that he saw earlier on top of the fiery chariot. Now this figure takes him by the hair while he's in this vision, carries him all the way from Babylonia to Jerusalem to the temple court. And then last week we saw he has a vision of 4 abominations in the temple area that are going to drive Yahweh from his sanctuary. Now the first is very important because it's going to reappear in Daniel, it's going to reappear in Revelation, it's going to reappear in statements by Jesus, where there is what he calls an abomination, which is a way of saying an idol. Someone has installed an idol in the temple courts. So that's the first thing. The second is he kind of breaks through a part of the wall of the temple, you'll recall, and he peeps in and he sees something going on that's not supposed to be going on. The elders, the 70 elders, which is the ancestors of the Sanhedrin, have scribbled all over the inner walls of the temple pictures of creeping things. And so there is a pagan idolatry going on. There's not just an idol in the outer court, but in the inner chambers of the temple, there's idolatry going on. And by the leaders, that's very important to Ezekiel, by the leaders themselves. This isn't just somebody who doesn't matter doing something off in private by themselves. This is the leadership itself participating in this. Third are the women who he sees participating in mourning rites for the ancient Sumerian deity. What is it? Tammuz.
Which means the good son.
Sometimes it's called Dumuzi or Tammuz. Very, very ancient ritual, weeping to bring about the spring rains, the death of Tammuz. And fourthly and finally, the religious leaders who are worshiping the sun as it rises in the east, so their back is to the temple. And there Ezekiel also refers for the first time to widespread bloodshed in the nation of Israel, which he's going to pick up on today. So today, Ezekiel's gone through those 4 abominations that will drive Israel out or drive Yahweh out of his temple. What are they? Idolatry, bloodshed. Idolatry and bloodshed. Those are the biggies. So today, if I'm picking up in Ezekiel chapter 10, verses 1 to 7, there's one more task that the divine figure on the chariot has to do before he takes off. Then I looked, chapter 10, verse 1, Ezekiel still in his vision. Behold, on the expanse that was over the head of the cherubim, the four creatures, there's a dais on which the divine throne sits that looks like the sky. And above it, there appeared something like sapphire, an appearance like a throne. And he said to the man clothed in linen, so the figure on the throne talks to the priestly figure we saw from last week, go in among the whirling wheels underneath the cherubim. Fill your hand with the burning coals from between the cherubim and scatter them over the city. So we got the divine chariot and the four living creatures, and there's these burning coals. And the priestly figure is to reach in, take some of the burning coals, and scatter them over the city. This imagery reappears in the book of Revelation all over the place, right? Where the angel casts down fire. He went in before my eyes. Now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the house when the man went in. House means the temple here. And a cloud filled the inner court. The glory of Yahweh went up from the cherubim to the threshold of the house. So Yahweh is getting up to leave. He's going to leave the temple. The house was filled with cloud. The court was filled with brightness of the glory of Yahweh. The sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer court, like the voice of El Shaddai when he speaks. When he commanded the man clothed in linen, take fire from between the whirling wheels, from between the cherubim, he went in, stood beside a wheel. The cherub stretched out his hand from between the cherubim to the fire that was between the cherubim, took some of it, put it into the hands of the man clothed with linen, who took it and went out. And then we have a description of the cherubim that follows that I'm not going to read in full. Ezekiel is the only figure I know of in the Old Testament to have claimed to have seen the cherubim. Other figures talk about the cherubim, and they certainly saw representations of them in the art of ancient Israel. But to have actually seen them, and Ezekiel goes on a very long description here. Picking up then in chapter 10, verse 18, we have this very long description, and we went over that a few lessons ago of the cherubim with the four different faces and the wings and all of the details. The glory of Yahweh went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. The cherubim lifted their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out with the wheels beside them. They stood at the entrance to the east gate of the house of Yahweh. The glory of the God of Israel was over them. So Yahweh's mounting his chariot on the outside of the temple, and he's getting ready to ride up over the hills. These were the living creatures I saw underneath the God of Israel by the Kebar Canal. I knew that they were cherubim. Each had four faces, each had four wings, and under their wings was the likeness of human hands. As for the likeness of their faces, they were the same faces whose appearance I had seen by the Kebar Canal. Each of them went straight forward. So now in Ezekiel chapter 11, we're sort of stopped. We're ready to see Yahweh ride off. And now we have an oracle that's going to deal with this burning question of who is the remnant of the people of Israel. Last week, we had that let judgment begin at the house of God scene. 6 executioners in Ezekiel's vision come out and beginning at the temple slaughter everybody in the temple precincts and in the city of Jerusalem with the sword. Now there's precedent for that for all of you Old Testament people. What's the first time the priestly leaders go throughout the Israelite encampment and slay the idolaters. Told you there was going to be a quiz. You're like, it's like back at school. Was that? Yes. After what event?
The golden calf.
Yes, everybody remember the golden calf story. So when that happens, a lot of people who are considered to be the leaders of the idolatry are simply slain right there. So there's precedent for that happening. Now, in this particular case, Ezekiel prayed last week, Yahweh, are you going to destroy the whole nation of Israel? And the idea is, well, no, there's going to be a remnant. Yahweh will preserve a people for himself, but then the question is, well, who? Who will survive? So, in chapter 11, verse 1, we encounter this text. I'll read up through verse 4. The Spirit lifted me up, and that word spirit can also be translated wind. And Ezekiel seems to be blown about by the wind on a regular basis. Not literally, but he's like the leaf in Forrest Gump. He's floating along. Behold, at the entrance of the gateway there were 25 men. Now these are the religious leaders we encountered last week, possibly. I saw among them Jaazaniah, the son of Azur, and Pelatiah, the son of Benaiah, princes of the people. Now we do not know who these people are, but the original readers certainly would have. It's expected that these are well-known specific figures. And he said to me, Son of man, these are the men who devise iniquity and give wicked counsel in this city, who say the time is not near to build houses. This city is the pot. The ESV here says cauldron, and we are the meat. Prophesy against them, prophesy, O Son of Man. So, apparently in Jerusalem, there's a saying, this city, Jerusalem, is the pot, and we are the meat. Exactly. What does that mean? Now, in sacrificial ritual, once you're done slaughtering the animal, the choicest parts of the animal are the ones that you put in the boiling pot. So the suggestion seems to be a lot of people have been taken in exile. A lot of people have died under the assault of Nebuchadnezzar. And the people who remain behind in Jerusalem are saying, particularly these two leaders, you know why we're still alive? Because we are the meat. That sounds like an Arby's commercial.
Yeah.
We have the meats. All right, so I think that is the sense. This city is the pot, and we are the meat. In other words, they're saying, why did those people die? Why were those people taken in exile? Because they're the bad ones. They're the bad ones. We're the good guys. So I mentioned here on page 36, another thing to bear in mind, and that comes up in this text too, these survivors in Jerusalem were newly rich because they had also taken over the property of the people who had been deported. That's another thing that happens in times of distress. When people die and when people are taken in exile, the leaders appropriate their wealth. So not only did they survive, but they're also newly wealthy, and they're living it up. So picking up Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 5, he has a word for them. The Spirit of the Lord fell upon me and said to me, say, thus says Yahweh. So you think, O house of Israel, so you think. For I know the things that come into your mind. You have multiplied your slain in the city, and you have filled its streets with the slain. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yahweh, your slain whom you have laid in the midst of it, they are the meat, and this city is the pot, but you shall be brought out of the midst of it. He's saying the good guys are the ones that are dead. The good guys are the ones that have been taken away. This city is the pot, but you guys are going to be thrown out the way the worthless parts of the animal are thrown out. You feared the sword, and I will bring the sword upon you, declares Adonai Yahweh. I will bring you out of the midst of it and give you into the hands of foreigners and execute judgments upon you, and you shall fall by the sword. I will judge you at the border of Israel, and you shall, this phrase repeated over and over again, you shall know that I am Yahweh. Now that's another expression we got to kind of deal with. You will be slain, and then you will know that I am Yahweh. Like, well, how does a dead... they're not thinking of the afterlife here, but the idea is that Yahweh will vindicate who he is in and through the justice that he metes upon the people. The city shall not be your cauldron, nor shall you be the meat in the midst of it. I will judge you at the border of Israel, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. So repetition, in case you didn't hear it the first time. You have not walked in my statutes or obeyed my rules, but have acted according to the rules of the nations that are around you. You're doing what everybody else is doing. And that is not why Yahweh called Israel. In verse 13, we're not quite sure what to do with this, but it sounds like something out of the book of Acts. It came to pass while I was prophesying that Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, died. And I fell down on my face and cried out with a loud voice and said, Ah, Adonai Yahweh, will you make a full end of the remnant of Israel? So one of the named leaders fell dead. We don't know exactly how. There's an irony. His name in Hebrew means Yahweh delivers. So there might be a little play on word there. Did he die while Ezekiel was prophesying? That's the way the text reads. Did other people observe it? Oh, what's the name of the character in the book of Acts whom Peter pronounces judgment against in the early church? Ananias and Sapphira. It's a similar kind of thing. And whenever a prophet of Israel says something and something happens, people will take notice.
Yeah, you have another one in Jeremiah where Jeremiah pronounces death upon a false prophet, and he dies.
And he dies. And that would be Hananiah,
Yeah.
who's, I don't know, probably still alive at the time of this. Hananiah. I wonder if that's related to Ananias. Seems close. I've never thought of that. That would be interesting. That would be interesting. Now, there's only one other section, and then Yahweh's going to go up over the hill and do his goodbye. But at this point, one of the questions is the people who are left in Israel, in Jerusalem, are they the remnant of Israel? And Ezekiel says no. The remnant of Israel are going to be the people who have been taken into exile, and the people who were slain are among Israel's best people. So, only the good die young, I guess. I'm just full of pop culture references today. And that seems true to life. Usually the noble and the righteous are the ones that suffer the most, and the bad guys usually manage to stay alive. On chapter 11, verse 14, and this is going to carry over into next week, we have the first, this phrase here, the word of Yahweh came to me, is the first of 14 oracles that happen in tow with this vision. There's exactly 14. And that ties this section off. We'll deal with the other 13 starting next week. 14 is a significant number. It's twice 7. And in ancient literature, it serves to kind of bracket stuff off and create a section. The others happen after the vision is over. But it starts with this one here. And this is a very, very famous passage from Ezekiel where he talks about the people of Israel being given a new heart. The remnant that will survive, and then when Yahweh returns, they come back to the land, he will give them a new heart. That language is found a lot in Jeremiah. This is another area where Ezekiel seems to channel Jeremiah. So I'm again reading in chapter 11, verse 14. In the lesson, I call this the true kinsman redeemers. The word of Yahweh came to me, Son of man, your brothers, even your brothers, your kinsmen, the whole house of Israel, all of them, are those of whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem have said, go far from Yahweh. To us this land is given for a possession. Therefore say, thus says Adonai Yahweh, though I remove them far off from the nations, and though I scatter them among the countries, yet I have been a sanctuary to them for a while in the countries where they have gone. Now, it's probably not clear, but this phrase here, your brothers have said, go far from Yahweh. To us this land is given for possession. In other words, the people in Jerusalem are saying to the exiles, get out of here. You guys are the problem. Go away. Get away from the Lord. You're creating too much trouble for us here. This is another reversal. Ezekiel is saying, no. Those people that they're sending away are the ones that Yahweh is with. Hence him meeting them all the way in Babylon. This verse right here. I removed them far off among the nations, and I scattered them among the countries, but I have been a sanctuary to them for a while in the countries where they have gone. So there's an irony here. The people in Jerusalem think that Yahweh is with them, but Yahweh is leaving Jerusalem, and he's going out to the people who are in exile. So reading some of these verses, sometimes we're not always clear exactly what it is that we're reading. You have to sort of get your head into what's going on in the passage. And then he says, verse 17, thus says Adonai Yahweh, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. Now, the word for the scattered people will eventually become known as this, the diaspora. So we have the early mention of, after the exile is over, the dispersed people of Israel will be regathered and brought back. And Yahweh will give them the land, even though they were the ones who were kicked out of it. In verse 18, when they come there, they will remove from it all its detestable things and all its abominations. So they're going to get rid of their idolatry when they come back. In here, verse 19, I will give them one heart, and a new spirit I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them. They shall be my people. I will be their God. Famous, famous words. And we read them, I think, a few weeks ago in the liturgy. Doug Stewart, he's not here. He read them. He got choked up reading this. I saw it during the liturgy. It was sweet. But as for those whose heart goes after their detestable things and their abominations, I will bring their deeds on their own heads, declares Adonai Yahweh. Okay. So, we usually think of the idea of a kinsman redeemer in connection with what story? The book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, well, Ruth's a Moabite. What's that? Boo?
Continue.
Are you against Moabite people?
Clearly, yes.
Okay. It's racist, prejudice against Moabites. And let's see, what Ruth's situation is, she's a widow, yes? Okay. And in order for her to, a close relative of her husband has this responsibility, which is laid out in Leviticus, to protect her and to protect her husband's property, his estate, and to ensure the continuance of her line and her children. He is to become her husband. And so he's a kinsman of her husband, but he is to redeem her, or he is to redeem her property, and help her to continue her family for the generations to come. Because, of course, in the ancient world, women did not have the advantages they have today in the West. A woman without a husband could lose her property. She would have no offspring, in many cases, to hand that property down or to carry on her husband's name, so she could become destitute. And so it's very, very important for a kinsman redeemer to... So Becky, if I die, Trav, you got to marry Becky. Sorry. Becky's like, I'll take my chances. I'll take my chances. Well, that's the same principle here. Who will inherit the land of Israel? Who will continue the covenant? Who will continue the worship of Yahweh for future generations? Ezekiel says it's going to be the exiles. And the exiles are the ones who the people back in Jerusalem are lambasting and are saying are no good. And Ezekiel's saying, no, those are the ones in and through whom the promises handed down through Moses will continue. And we won't see it in the book of Ezekiel, but that's exactly what happens. Now let me see if there's any questions here. We'll get to conclude with Yahweh's grand exit.
So I'm confused on the set before this, where the leader dies, and Ezekiel, he fell on his face and cried with a loud voice. It seems like he's, and they say, with the full and with the remnant, so it seems like he's mourning the death of that guy. That's verse 13.
Yes.
So it's strange because to me it seemed like he was mourning and saying,
Well, no, that's a good question. I don't get the idea that Ezekiel himself quite knows what the remnant of Israel will be. This is the second time where he's done that. He said, Yahweh, are you going to destroy the remnant of Israel? And in both cases, it's connected with the death of the people in Jerusalem. So one gets the idea that Ezekiel himself, it hasn't even quite dawned on him that the exiles are the ones who will return to the land. For the most part, they think they're done. And the popular view in the day, right now, that Ezekiel have to fight against next week, is that Jerusalem will not be taken. Jerusalem will survive, and then they will own the land and continue for the future. The idea that Nebuchadnezzar is going to destroy Jerusalem and its temple, and that the whole nation of Israel will collapse, nobody wants that to happen. Nobody's willing to even play with the idea that will happen, except for a few of the prophets. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are among them. Yeah.
I was just going to say, Jeremiah had a similar thing in a vision where he saw two baskets of figs. One were really good figs, one were really rotten figs, unfit to be eaten. And the good figs represent the remnant that will survive, but Jeremiah says it's the ones in exile who are the good figs. The ones in Jerusalem are the bad figs, and they're going to be thrown out. So it's it's not the same imagery, but it's a very similar concept.
Yeah.
in Jeremiah.
And to your point, I don't think Ezekiel or Jeremiah really like their prophecies. They're delivering them, but you don't get the idea that they enjoy them. And they are shocked themselves at some of the messages that they have to deliver.
I should think that the prophets had a degree of patriotism sort of in their poems, and announcing disaster for your own people and your own nation is not a very easy thing to do.
Yeah. They wanted to make Israel great again. They really did. Get rid of crooked Joe Biden, this thing. So, yeah, I think they were very patriotic. I think that's the anguish. They loved their country. They loved their people. They loved their heritage. And yet they had to deliver a scathing judgment. And the prophets feel themselves to be part of the judgment. Even Isaiah says, I am a man of unclean lips. He doesn't say, those bad people out there. He says, I'm one of them. The prophets themselves experienced the guilt of the stuff that they were declaring against their fellow people. So over on page 37 in the lesson here, we'll probably end a little earlier today than usual because I won't spend too long on this. Sort of in 3 stages, Yahweh gets up and gets on the threshold of the temple. That's the first stage. And Ezekiel spreads them out. And then he intersperses these oracles between them. And then the second stage, which we saw just a moment ago, he gets up on his divine chariot and he's ready to go. Now, thirdly and finally is the culmination. He's going to leave the temple. Chapter 11, verse 22, and I'll just read through verse 25. The cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them. The glory of the God of Israel was over them. The glory of the God of Israel is his presence, which appears as a fiery whirlwind. And in the midst of it, Ezekiel, the fiery whirlwind is from the book of Exodus. But Ezekiel adds in the midst of the fiery whirlwind this shadowy human-like figure that looks like it's glowing fire. So the glory of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. So now he's actually left Jerusalem. And what's the mountain on the east side of Jerusalem? Mount of Olives. Now that's got an important history in the Bible. Now it's east of Jerusalem, so that's important. I mentioned as you head east, you're headed away from Yahweh's sanctuary. So the Mount of Olives has a symbolic significance. On the one hand, it means away from the temple. But it reappears quite a bit in the New Testament. Many of you know the story of David and Absalom. King David had a very unhappy family life. He was a successful king. Family life, not so successful. and his son Absalom tries to steal the throne from him, right? And actually is successful to the point that King David is driven out of the palace and out of Jerusalem and heads into exile east toward the Mount of Olives. So, you knowing those stories, when Jesus heads east of Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives on the night that he's arrested, it conjures up resonances of the Old Testament. And now also in the book of Ezekiel, Yahweh heads east to the Mount of Olives. I put a lengthy footnote here, footnote 68. Let's see if there's anything I missed here. Metaphoric significance of the east is in the Garden of Eden. They head east of Eden. Abraham sends Ishmael east. And then stories of Moses since the days of David and Absalom. I just mentioned that. And now in Ezekiel. Now later, the prophet Zechariah will say that Yahweh will return to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. So in his vision of Yahweh coming back to Jerusalem, he draws on the idea of the Mount of Olives as the last place Yahweh was seen. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. Jews in the first century believed that the resurrection of the dead would begin there after the coming of the Messiah. In the New Testament, Jesus wept over Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And that actually kind of draws attention to this verse here. I want to see how it translates in the ESV. Chapter 11, verse 22. Verse 23, the glory of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain east of the city. That could also be translated stopped. This verse has received a lot of attention, even in ancient commentary, because Yahweh is moving and he stops. And the rabbis interpreted that to mean that he was reluctant to leave. And that was a very, very powerful idea. Yahweh doesn't want to leave Jerusalem. And so one of the medieval midrash says that Yahweh stayed on the Mount of Olives, let's see, did I mention it here? For several days or weeks, calling for the city to repent. Maybe up until the destruction of the actual city. Now, the biblical text doesn't say that, but they're grabbing hold of this idea that, well, you know how it is. You ever had an argument or something happen and you walk away and then you stop halfway out and you hesitate for a moment because you haven't made up your mind yet. So this little passage in verse 23, it's just a single verse, but the stopping or the lingering or standing on the mount. And then Ezekiel comes to the end of his vision. Spirit lifted me up, or again the wind, brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God back into Chaldea, so he's back in Babylonia now, to the exiles. The vision that I had seen went up from me. I told the exiles all the things that Yahweh had showed me. Now, it's not exactly clear exactly how visions work. Did Ezekiel literally go to Jerusalem? He went in a vision. But he's back in Babylonia now. Oh, yes. So I'm not talking about Ichabod Crane here. He was killed by the headless horseman, or so they say. All they found was a shattered pumpkin. Does anybody know where the word Ichabod comes from in the book of Samuel? Cold call. Nate. No? Ryland. We read this year in ancient history class. I know it's right there. It's like on my test, the answer's right there. And they still don't get it. It's like, look at it. So back in the days of Samuel, before ancient Israel had a king, they're living in the land of Israel. There's no palace, there's no standing army, so they are constantly at war with these indigenous people who live here. And occasionally some freedom fighter like Samson, or who are some other famous judges? Othniel, Deborah, a kind of charismatic leaders rise and lead the nation for a season until they get back together. Samuel's the last of these before the kingdom comes, before the kingship starts, but they're in war with the Philistines. The tabernacle is in a place called Shiloh, and the Philistines wipe out the town, and they capture the Ark of the Covenant, and they take the Ark of the Covenant into their Philistine encampment. The high priest at the time is a man named Eli, and I think when he hears the news, he falls back on his chair and breaks his neck. So an inglorious way to end his days. He has a son named Phinehas, who's one of the priests, and his wife is giving birth. While this event is happening, she names her son Ichabod, which means the glory is gone from Israel. I believe that's how the story goes. Very tragic story. When I leave my classroom at school at the end of the day, I'm going to have a little sign, and I'll hang it from the door that says Ichabod. The glory is gone. Now, I've just decided I'm going to do it. We'll see if you'll get my joke. You can't tell anybody my joke. All right. Just hang it from the door. Let me see if there's any questions. I'll make a few comments, and then we'll end a little earlier today than usual, because next week we'll have some other stuff.
The glory of God, which in the tabernacle and later the temple is kind of a visible cloud, starts in the Exodus, but it enters the tabernacle when they get it built, and then it will enter the temple, Solomon's temple, when that's built. So that's a visible kind of thing, at least apparently it is. But often the word glory is not used in a way that sounds visible. And it's a tricky kind of word. You mostly only hear it in religious circles. You don't really hear it much outside that common language of the street. So I often get the question from students, so what is the glory? What is glory? You get to the New Testament, you find the word glory has to do with the afterlife, or we see the glory of God in the face of Jesus. Paul says that on one occasion. What does that mean? I'm just curious of your ideas. I have a few ideas myself, but I'd like your
Well, that's a good question. Well, I get asked that question. Usually I find it in other religious literature outside the Bible. So I always say glory is the manifestation of one's potential. So, for example, a basketball player can have a glorious night on the court. He shows everybody what he's capable of. And you can give glory to someone when they show their glory. Now, that's a trivial example. But if we go to Homer's Iliad, Achilles is all about glory. Now, for Achilles, glory means killing other people because he's a warrior. So he wins glory for himself by showing his potential as a warrior on the battlefield. The glory of Yahweh manifests its power on earth visibly, parts of the Old Testament. But Jesus does some amazing things with this idea in the New Testament. John's gospel particularly, when Jesus shows his glory, is the cross. Now that's a paradox, because nobody thinks that you show forth your potential by dying on a cross. But he says that in the Gospel of John. He says, "For this very reason I have come, to show forth the Father's glory. Father, glorify your name." And the writer of John says in the early part of the Gospel, we have seen his glory. So I think the idea of glory is a very ancient idea. It's cross-cultural. But I do think that Jesus does some things with it in the New Testament that are very challenging. They challenge our ordinary idea of what power is, what glory is. Self-sacrifice and love to the point of self-sacrifice for Christ is his glory. It's God's glory. And so he takes up this ancient idea. And so that's sometimes what I do with it. Did you have a comment, Trev?
I was going to say, and everything you're talking about seems to imply an observer. Like glory, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it is for the sake of those observing, maybe.
There does have to be something observed about it because you show your potential. And those who observe or are participants give glory. But it is a form of communication. Yahweh's presence is his glory, but his presence is what in and through which he exercises his power on earth. If God is present in Christ, Jesus says that he is, God is present in him, God exercises his power in and through Jesus Christ. And his power is shown on the cross. And then, of course, vindicated later in the resurrection. In the resurrection, Jesus shows that the origin of life and being lives in him. He's indestructible. Yeah, the transfiguration. And then the stoning of Stephen you mentioned. Talk a little bit about what you're thinking there. Yes. Yeah, I want to actually take a look at that passage while we're talking about it. He said his face was like that of an angel, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that in the sermon because I'm doing Paul, and Paul's going to be persecuting believers. So we'll definitely have to talk about Stephen. Chapter 7, Acts, verse 55. He, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. So he has a vision of God and Christ. And then he says that, "Behold, I see." Yeah. But you're right, the word glory is not one that gets used much, and we kick it around in religious circles. It's a difficult word to define.
The basic idea of glory as a word means weight or weightiness.
Mm-hmm.
In a few cases, it is used not of God or something like that, but of something that is just heavy. For instance, in the book of Judges, there's this really fat guy, which we say was fat, and that's the way it's translated, but what it says in Hebrew is he was a man of glory, or weightiness. He was.
I believe that was Eglon, king of Moab. You should have known he was a Moabite.
But anyway, the idea of weightiness is interesting in connection with all the other ideas we're talking about. And I think it might suggest, I don't know, something along the lines of intensity, maybe? I'm not sure, but weightiness is a word we use for objects, but the glory of God isn't an object in that sense, but it still carries weight.
Well, so what did C.S.
Modern saying, well, that's heavy.
C.S. Lewis wrote The Weight of Glory? Yeah, what you just said right there. We still use that expression. Dude, it's heavy. Man, that's heavy. Yeah, it's an interesting word. Throughout much of the Old Testament, we'll kind of close with this. These are good thoughts to conclude with. The glory, the kavod, refers to the fiery manifestation of Yahweh's presence. But of course, that is in and through which he exercises his power, indwelling the tabernacle, protecting the people of Israel, defeating their enemies, going before them in their battles, zapping anybody who gets too close. So that's his glory. You do have one, I guess to close with this idea, you do have that story of Elijah the prophet that suggests that Yahweh's glory will manifest itself in different ways over time. Because when Elijah goes to Mount Sinai, they kind of replay the Moses story. There's an earthquake and there's the fire and the cloud. Maybe you know it, and each time it says Yahweh wasn't in the earthquake. Yahweh wasn't in the cloud. Yahweh wasn't in the lightning or the fire. And then it says there was this difficult to translate Hebrew word. Most of us grew up with gentle whisper or still small voice, I think in the KJV. I don't know how to translate that. That's a fun one. But Elijah covers his face, which is exactly what you do when you encounter Yahweh's glory. It's a very mysterious passage, but it suggests that Yahweh doesn't always manifest his glory in the same way. And in this particular case, all of the old ways of doing things are not how he's expressing himself in this particular case. And that, I think of as sort of a halfway house, too, of the way Jesus talks about glory in the New Testament. So anyways, we got a whole new lesson next week. That was a really nice discussion, but we got to go get some food, so thank you.